The United States is openly discussing control of a territory that could reshape global power overnight, and almost nobody is paying attention. Greenland is no longer a joke, it's becoming a geopolitical flashpoint. Today we need to talk about something that at first glance sounds almost unbelievable, but the more you look into it, the more serious it becomes. The United States, Greenland, and the growing conversation about control, power, and global security. Now, when you hear Greenland, your first reaction might be to laugh it off because, yes, this isn't the first time this topic has surfaced. Several years ago, the idea of the United States acquiring Greenland was treated like a joke. Headlines mocked it, but here's the thing, this conversation never actually went away. It went quiet, it went underground, and now it's back. And this time, people are paying attention. Back in 2019, the United States openly approached Denmark with a proposal to purchase Greenland. At that time, it sounded absurd to many people. Why would anyone want Greenland? It's mostly ice, it's freezing cold, and hardly anyone lives there. But Greenland isn't just a frozen wasteland, it is the largest island on Earth. And before anyone jumps in to argue, Greenland, technically speaking, is an island and it is massive. In fact, it's roughly 3 times larger than the next biggest island on the planet. And yet, despite its size, Greenland has a population of just around 57,000 people. That's smaller than many towns. So why does something so cold, so remote, and so sparse population matter so much? Why would the most powerful country in the world care about it? To understand that, we need to stop thinking about Greenland as land and start thinking about it as location, because geography is power. Greenland sits almost entirely within the Arctic Circle. Around 80% of it remains frozen year-round. Temperature often stays below zero. Life there is harsh, economic activity is limited. There are no massive cities, no industrial hubs, no large consumer markets. And yet, strategically, Greenland is one of the most important places on Earth. And that's not speculation, that's military reality. But before we get into why Greenland matters so much, we need to talk about what changed. Because something happened recently that caused people to stop laughing and start listening. Following recent events in Venezuela, where US forces intervened and removed the sitting leadership, governments around the world began re-evaluating earlier statements that they once brushed aside. What once sounded like exaggeration suddenly felt possible, and shortly after those events, remarks about Greenland resurfaced, this very time a very different tone. Speaking abroad, Air Force One, the subject came up again, and while the delivery included humor, the message underneath was unmistakable. There was joking, there was banter, but there was also a timeline. At first, the comment was framed casually, something like "we will talk about it in a couple of months." Then almost immediately that timeline shortened. 2 months become weeks, weeks become days, and when timelines shrink like that, it tells you something important. It means the issue is active, it means it's being discussed behind closed doors, and it means decisions are being evaluated right now. Because global power don't joke about timelines unless those conversations are already happening internally. The claim was no longer that Greenland would be nice to have, the claim was that Greenland is needed. Needed for national security, needed to control strategic routes, needed to counter foreign influence, and that's when Russia and China entered the conversation. According to statements made publicly, Greenland is now surrounded by increasing Russian and Chinese activity, particularly maritime movement in Arctic waters. This isn't about tourism, this is about shipping lanes, military positioning, submarine routes, missile detection, and future trade corridors that will be open as Arctic ice continues to melt. The Arctic is no longer a frozen barrier, it's becoming a highway, and Greenland sits right in the middle of it. From a military standpoint, whoever controls Greenland gains some massive advantage in monitoring and responding to movement across the northern hemisphere. That's why this conversation isn't hypothetical anymore, and it's also why some officials are no longer willing to rule anything out. When asked directly whether military force could ever be used to secure Greenland, the response was carefully worded, not a yes but not a no either. Instead, the argument shifted. The focus moved to Denmark's claim over Greenland. Questions were raised about historical control, about colonial authority, about whether a distant European country should retain power over territory that is geographically closer to North America than to Europe. And here is an important fact that often gets overlooked. Greenland is about 1800 miles away from Denmark. Meanwhile, it's only about 800 miles from the United States. If you measure from Alaska, geographically Greenland is closer to North America. It has its own identity. It exists in a gray zone, and strategically it is becoming priceless. The argument being made is not just about ownership, it's about responsibility. The claim is that Denmark lacks the capacity to fully secure Greenland in the era of rising Arctic competition, and the United States, as the dominant military force within NATO, already bears much of burden for Arctic defense anyway. So the question becomes, who should control Greenland, who can protect it, and who benefits from that control? Now, some of the commentary around this has been intentionally provocative. For example, there was a remark about Denmark increasing Greenland security by adding an additional dog sled patrol. It was framed humorously, almost dismissively, but interestingly enough, it wasn't entirely untrue. Greenland actually does rely on dog sled patrols in some of its most remote regions. They are used for surveillance, transportation, and territorial monitoring. So while the comment was meant to belittle, it was grounded in reality, and the message behind it was clear. Greenland is vast, Greenland is remote, and Greenland is lightly defended. That doesn't mean an invasion is imminent, but it does mean that Greenland is vulnerable, and vulnerability attracts interest. Now, on the other side of this conversation, Denmark is taking the situation very seriously. Public statements from Danish leadership indicate genuine concern, not just about territorial control, but about what this means for global stability. Because Greenland isn't just connected to Denmark, it's connected to NATO, and NATO operates on one foundational principle: an attack on one member is an attack on all. So when Danish officials suggest that any military action against Greenland would fundamentally undermine NATO itself, they are not exaggerating. They are drawing a red line. They are saying that borders cannot be changed by force, that international rules still matter, and that even powerful nations are bound by agreements. But here's the uncomfortable truth. History shows that rules matters until power decides otherwise, and that's why this conversation is unsettling, because Greenland has suddenly become part of the same geopolitical language. And now that Greenland is being discussed in the context of military capability, alliance integrity, and global security, it's a strategic question. We are going to look more closely at why Greenland matters so much, not just today but for the future of global power. Because once you see from the map, from the right angle, everything changes. So now let's talk about Greenland itself. What actually happens there? What does the country produce? And does it have anything the United States economically wants? The short answer is not much. Greenland's primary industry is fishing, and that's not surprising. The surrounding waters are rich, cold, and productive, and fishing has sustained the population for generations. Beyond that, Greenland does contain significant underground resources. There are deposits of rare earth minerals, there is gold, there is uranium. On paper that sounds extremely valuable, but in reality those resources have largely been left untouched. And the reason is simple: environmental risk. Digging deep into frozen Arctic land is dangerous, expensive, and highly controversial. Denmark has been cautious about opening Greenland up to large-scale mining operations because once you disturb permafrost, you don't just extract minerals, you permanently alter the land, and in the Arctic damage is often irreversible. So Greenland has never been aggressively developed as a resource hub, which brings us back to the real question. If it's not about mining, if it's not about population, then why does the United States care so much? The answer lies in water movement and visibility, shipping routes, military pathways, and early warning systems. If you look at the global map from above the North Pole, not the usual flat projection, but a top-down view, everything changes. The Arctic suddenly stops looking remote, instead it becomes central. From that perspective, Greenland sits directly along the route that connects Russia, Europe, and North America. As Arctic ice melts, new shipping lanes are opening. Routes that once were impossible are becoming viable, and any vessel moving from the Arctic Ocean into the Atlantic has to pass through areas near Greenland. That includes commercial ships, but more importantly, it includes military vessels, submarines, surveillance ships, and potentially missile platforms. Russia, in particular, becomes very visible on these maps. The distance suddenly feels much shorter, and that's why Greenland is so important defensively. It's not about launching attacks, it's about detection. It's if a missile were ever launched toward North America from the Arctic region, and to be clear, this is a hypothetical, early detection would be critical. Seconds matter, minutes matter, and Greenland provides one of the best geographic position on Earth for early warning systems. That's why the United States already has a major presence there. There is a US military installation on Greenland that has existed for decades. It was formerly known as Thule Air Base. Today it's called Pitofix Space Base. The base plays a key role in monitoring satellites, tackling missile activity, and observing movements across the Arctic. In other words, Greenland is already part of America's defense infrastructure, and from the US perspective, that creates a problem. Because the base may be American, but the land it sits on is not, which means ultimate control rests everywhere, and that's where concern about Russian and Chinese activity enters the conversation. Statements have been made suggesting increased foreign vessel presence around Greenland. Denmark has pushed back on those claims, saying they don't see evidence of widespread hostile activity, but from the US point of view, perception matters just as much as reality. If Washington believes Greenland could become contested space in the future, then waiting becomes risky. So the motivation here appears to be overwhelmingly defensive. Greenland isn't being targeted because of what can be taken from it, it's being targeted because of what can be seen from it. However, and this is important, if Greenland were ever to become US territory, everything would change. Mining restriction could be revisited, rare earth extraction could accelerate, strategic resources could suddenly become economically viable. So while defense is the primary motivation, long-term resource access is clearly a secondary consideration. Now here's a small but interesting detail. Before researching this topic, many people, myself included, had never actually seen the flag of Greenland. It's not widely recognized. It's a red and white design with a circular shape offset to one side. Some people compare it loosely to Japan's flag, but inverted and asymmetrically. It's distinctive, and now you know it. Now let's zoom out and ask the big question. Is the United States actually going to try to take Greenland by force? A week ago, most people would have said no, absolutely not. The idea would have sounded unthinkable. The last time the US carried out anything remotely similar was decades ago. But recent events have shifted perception. They have changed how seriously people take these statements. Because the language has hardened, Greenland isn't being described as optional, it's being described as necessary. Not we want it, but we need it. And that difference matters. So what does a deal even look like? So what would change? Technically, the US already has what it needs operationally. The base exists. Early warning systems are active, monitoring is already happening. So why push further? Why escalate the conversation? The honest answer is we don't fully know. But what is clear is that the current arrangement is not satisfying Washington. From the US perspective, partial access may not be enough in a future where Arctic competition intensifies. Full control removes uncertainty, and that brings us to a much bigger issue, the future of NATO. NATO is built on mutual defense. If one member is attacked, others respond. That alliance has expanded recently because countries near Russia feel increasingly threatened. But here's the paradox. Does the United States actually want automatic military obligation in Europe right now? That question has been raised openly. There has been frustration about financial burden, about unequal contribution, about long-term commitment. So now we are faced with a strange possibility. What if Greenland becomes more important to the US than the alliance itself? What if securing Greenland is viewed as more critical than preserving the current NATO structure? That would change everything, and that's why this issue matters far beyond Greenland, because it touches alliances, it touches borders, and it touches how power is exercised in a world that is becoming less stable. Greenland has only 57,000 people, that's the population of a small town, yet it sits at the center of a global power struggle. It's possible that the people of Greenland could eventually be asked to decide their future. No one knows yet. But one thing is clear, this will be one of the defining geopolitical discussion of 2026, and based on the timelines mentioned publicly, whether that's weeks or months, this conversation is not far away. So for now, we watch, we listen, and we pay attention, because sometimes the most important changes in world politics begins in places almost nobody was looking at.